welcome everybody. Glad to have you back here in the studio with myself and Synova Cantrell. Welcome, Synova. I'm really glad to have you helping me with this story.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I appreciate you asking.
Now, Synova, if people want to find out more about you, how do they find out more about you?
The best place to go is synovainc.com, INK, SYNOVAINK.com. My website, or you can find me, Synova Cantrell, on any of the social media platforms, YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, all those kind of things.
All right, great. And guys, Synova is kind of an expert on the Dixie Mafia, that organized crime kind of through the Mid-South and a variety of other things. She's ran wouldn't call it a self-help podcast, but or a YouTube channel, but something that, an inspirational channel. If you want to learn how to write a book and you're running into trouble, why she'd be somebody that could help you out with that, couldn't you, Synova?
I went from writing true crime cold cases as a victim's advocate, and I wanted to help a little more than just raise awareness about their case. So I went into studying coaching and self-help and different types of therapy and psychology and things to try to help victims' family members. And then I had several cold cases draw me back. So I'm kind of blending psychology and true crime all together. So I'm kind of an enigma. I'm kind of
right.
Mixed up mess.
Really, and that's what we're doing here, folks. We're blending a little psychology, like what made this guy, this Bob Berdella guy, what made him do this? Now, if you haven't been listening, we were talking about Bob Berdella. This is the fourth and final episode. He was a serial killer in Kansas City, known as Bob the Butcher. There's plenty of books out him. I've got one of the investigators who has written a book called Rites of Burial, Sergeant Troy Cole, and you'll get some clips from him talking about what he ran into in the midst of this investigation. And he killed 6 young men that we know of, and he tortured every one of them before he killed them. And he also took pictures of all this, and we've got all that. And there's a really good book called Rites of Burial that I mentioned. Troy was part of the writing of that book, and so let's get back into it now. We know that he tricked these guys, or he befriended them, and then he got them under his control in some way with some kind of drugs or alcohol, and then he tied them to a bed and tortured them. And the police, the last one escaped. This kid named Chris Bryson escaped, and he got across the street, and they called the police. And then Bob Berdella came home, and they had the story by then. They took him in, and then they served a search warrant on the house. And so we're going to talk a little bit about what they found, and then about the subsequent investigation, because what they found was an envelope with Polaroid photos of like 300 some photos of Polaroid photos of young men in the process of being tortured, or several of them, they appeared to be dead. For example, one was a body hanging from a basement rafters over a tub. And as Troy said, they had the liver, all the blood had gone down to the lower extremities. He said there's no doubt that guy was dead. The others, they couldn't tell for sure. Several of them appeared to be dead when he took the photos. They found a torture log where he had used things like, when they died, he'd put 86. That's an old military term, I think. 86 something. You throw it away, you throw it out. And they say he got that from when he was a cook. He used to be a cook in different nice restaurants in Kansas City. And if they'd throw out a dish or some meat or some food, they'd say 86 it. So this job was really complicated for these detectives, because all these kids were they were all street kids in some form or another, estranged from their families, been on the streets, some of them working as male prostitutes and petty thieves and drug dealers. I would say every one of them was some kind of a drug addict. So now we've got these pictures. We've got one live victim. We can charge him with Chris Bryson. You've got one live victim that you can charge Berdella with kidnapping and, holding prisoner and sodomy and a variety of other, really minor crimes compared to first-degree murder, which what those Polaroids would indicate. And they form a task force to identify all the rest of the victims and put these cases together. They do it in police headquarters in what's known as a show-up room, and that's a place where detectives ran lineups for witnesses to look at suspects. Well, they had these Polaroid photos, and everybody wanted to see them. Cops just kept interrupting, streaming in, wanting to see the famous torture Polaroids. Plus, the press is smelling around too, and they're wanting to see them, and they're wanting to find out more information. Troy went to his captain, and he got him to move him to an off-site location that was more private, and people didn't know where it was. So, Synova, let's talk a little bit about the public and these cops' fascination with these gruesome images. Where do you think that comes from?
Well, it's one of those morbid curiosity type things that you look in. People used to make a living off of finding unfortunate souls that looked odd, and they would take them around to circuses, and people would look at them and pay money to stare at them. And nowadays we think, how inhumane is that? These are poor unfortunate people anyways, and yet they made a living off of this. Ripley's, believe it or not, there's a museum down in Branson. He went all around the world trying to find morbid, strange, odd things, because we have this nature within us that we're kind of drawn to that. We're curious about it. We don't understand how somebody could do this to another human being. We don't understand how this person could look this way or behave this way, and so we're kind of drawn to it. We're terrified and grossed out, and all this with it, but we're also kind of drawn to it, trying to figure out, why would somebody do this? How could somebody do this? And then of course there's the investigation. Some cops are probably trying to clear some things off their books, but then this is not something you hear very often. I mean, you hear people getting murdered all the time, people get killed all the time, people get raped all the time, all these things happen, but you don't hear of people taking 300 some odd photos. And so it's very unusual, but it's almost like we've got that animalistic nature. We have to see what's going on, just like the rubberneckers, when there's a huge accident and there's somebody that will almost cause another accident just to try to see what's going on. I was like, well, keep your nose in your own business and get on down the road, but it's that same curiosity factor, trying to figure it out. And also you look at it, and I know sometimes your brain shuts off when you look at some of those things. You think, this can't be real. This can't be a real human going through this. This can't be a real situation. But it is, and so all of those things kind of play into that curiosity. And unfortunately, as humans, we have this morbid curiosity. And unfortunately, these kinds of things just feed into that.
Yeah, really. I think one thing is we want to see that in order to say, well, that's not me, that's not anybody I know, that's them. That make those victims into some other thing that we're superior to, and we somehow can convince ourselves that that would never happen to us. I think there's a little bit of self-protection in looking at those pictures.
There is, and then also you look at it and you think there's a level of safety there, because you're looking at a photo.
Yeah.
And then you want to say, well, I would never get into that situation.
Yeah.
But then you might turn around and make the choices that put you in that situation. So it's, why do women like true crime shows? People are the same thing. Women, my target audience is women 35 and up, ex-law enforcement, or people going into a law enforcement career. I've noticed there's some college kids that are kind of interested in what I do. But other than that, everyone else, they don't care what I'm doing. But women 35 and up, we like, why? Is it a self-preservation technique? We think, okay, well, I'm going to learn all these things, and then I'm going to make sure not do those things. I don't know. It's just something, the way we're hardwired in our psychology, I think.
Yeah, it's always about safety, staying safe, and there's something about somehow that gives us some at least false feeling of safety. Maybe we learn enough of a real feeling of safety. But anyhow, so the guys, the Troy Cole, he had copies made of all these photos and sent out two-person teams to hit the streets. And because they had no names, they went to halfway houses and drug and alcohol recovery centers. They hit the Salvation Army and all the shelters. They hit the streets around the bus station where all the what we used to call affectionately fruit hustlers would show up. All these young guys that the chicken hawks were preying on, and started showing these photos. And as they did this, they started getting some partial names, some nicknames, some street names, maybe a full name or what they think might be a full name once in a while, but they also went to the media for help. Now, Synova, share us your experience with going to the media. You're talking about going to cold cases, going to the media for help. How effective is that? How you done that?
I'm not, and this is one of those things I'm kind of, I am kind of tongue tied with it because it's one of those necessary evils.
Yeah.
But I also come from a side as a victim's advocate. So you have the mainstream media does what it does and it does it well, but it's not all encompassing. So I found with cold cases, I had to create my own media. I had to become a publishing house. I had to get an audience huge enough to get this story out because it wasn't sensational enough for the standard media to take. And so I have a little bit of a back and forth view of the media. You can take things to the media all you want, but if it's not sensational enough, they're not going to pick it up. They're not going to help you. Of course, in this situation, if you got 300 gruesome photographs, it's sensational. But in other cases, I find it's not helpful at all. I've worked with victims' family members who, on the 19th anniversary of the father being slaughtered, Vietnam veteran, retired, went into another service, a community service, retired from that, was stabbed and left to die by someone, an illegal alien that wasn't supposed to be here, and she was told that it wasn't news on the 19th anniversary. On the 20th anniversary, they did do a little short write-up, but I'm sitting there going, what's not sensational about that? Our war hero was killed and left to die on the dirt by someone that wasn't even supposed to be here. It's sensational. But so when it comes to the media, it's kind of it's a catch-22. If it's something that they are going to get enough ratings for, nowadays is a lot worse than it used to be because everybody's fighting for those views, including the standard media. And so they'll bypass somebody that needs some serious help because they want something more sensational. So when it comes to cold cases, that's the way I've found, just in my 5 years worth of working cold cases, that I had to become the media myself. At one point, I had my potential viewership up to 500,000. I'm not there now because I stepped away. I'm coming back though. Just hide and watch. But when you're trying to find all these, the next thing you have to understand too is when you're trying to find all these victims that are street people, who's going to know them on the news? A lot of times they're so separated that you can show their picture all day long. Nobody that has access to the news is going to know who they are. Now, if you take that media down to the streets, they know who that is. So the media is a catch-22. I have a love-hate relationship with standard media.
Yeah, it's a double-edged sword. One problem when you're looking for a suspect is you get so many nutcases calling in that you have to expend manpower or people power to go out and run down leads because you can't really lead unless it just is totally crazy. You got to send somebody out, and so it just will triple or quadruple your leads that get called in just because of that, and that they probably learned that in this case. It did help a little bit, but it didn't really help all that much. And and today, this was before Facebook. Now today, there are Facebook pages out there or groups that are just about missing persons, for example. And so that would be a good one because family members will, maybe they haven't seen this kid in a long time, and maybe a sibling at least will, maybe look at those once in a while to see if they see anything. So there are a variety of ways you can use the media, but as you say, you have to be skillful doing it, and you just can't go to the local mainstream media and expect them to really do anything. You really have to work at it yourself.
You have to work hard. It's down to whether I've worked with people trying to solve their missing loved one's case or their family's homicide case or whatever, and people want this concept, and maybe it's partly Hollywood and fairy tale we expect this knight in shining armor to come racing in. We expect Wyatt Earp. We expect, the Lone Ranger, somebody to come in and just take it and run with it and get us justice. And unfortunately, that's not the way it works. You find that you're fighting alongside, you're fighting sometimes more to get the attention you're fighting too. There's no one going to come and rescue you, and there's no one going to come and just solve your case on their own. And I think that's one of the big shocks from victims' family members, from just working with them and trying to coach them and help them. They just expect that this magical lawman's going to show up and he's going to have all the answers, because that's the way it works in Hollywood. They happen to have every I always hated Nancy Drew because she just happened to have some tape when she needed it, or she just happened to have this when she had a paper clip when she needed. I don't have paper clips in my pocket so I can get out of handcuffs, but we expect that. And I think in with victims' family members, a lot, they expect this, this knight in shining armor with a badge to be able to fix it all. And that's not reality. And I think that's part of, what's so difficult in these cases. If they're hard enough to solve, but you've got one guy, I was looking, I'm researching the cold case now, and for entire St. Louis County is huge, part of Missouri. St. Louis County, they've got one half of a guy, he said half of a guy, working all of the cold cases for St. Louis County.
Yeah.
Meaning he's a part-time, 2 days a week, he works on those cold cases. So we also want to think somebody's going to come in and rescue us and solve the case. There may not be someone, or there may be a half a guy, which I thought that was funny the way he's, there's a half a guy working all the cold cases. There's just not enough, there's not enough funding, there's not enough manpower, there's, not everybody has access to the technology that we see on, the FBI files or stuff like that. Not everybody has access to that kind of technology to solve these things. And so that makes it difficult too.
Yeah, really. So let's listen to what Sergeant Cole has to say about what they went through trying to locate these guys. So by 6 to 8 weeks into the investigation, they had eventually what they believe is all the 6 men identified. Took some doing, but as you heard, but they got them all identified. Well, now the legal maneuvering started. Now they've got to have somebody that they can file a case. As I mentioned before, they've got Chris Bryson, but that's not a murder case. They've got Jerry Howe, but they don't have a body. They're pretty sure that one of those pictures is him, but they can't prove it. And they don't really have a body, and the picture isn't really quite enough. Now, they do have that recently buried head that they dug up in the backyard. That's a pretty good candidate. And so far, he hadn't been identified, but they will get him identified. If you remember the guy who Berdella was forcing this man to give him oral sex, and a guy bit down hard on Berdella's penis. And Berdella showed up at the hospital later that night for treatment, and he even filed a police report for some reason, go figure. And he named that guy. Now go figure that one. What kind of idiot's that? He kind of misspelled the name, but just slightly. And so they were able to then determine who that guy was and go to his relatives. I believe he's from Wichita, and he was missing. And then they found some kind of DNA, I believe. They really identified that head as being his. So now you got a good solid murder case, and they're starting into the actual legal wrangling as they've got a murder case ready to file. Now, Synova, let's talk a little bit about the toll that these kinds of crimes take on victims' relatives. Even though these kids are, they're like the ne'er-do-wells, the black sheep of the family, maybe. They maybe have been disowned by some members of family. I've ran into these kids' families myself who are just real strong Christians. You go in their house, they've got crosses on the wall, and everything is just perfect and in its place, but you just saw that kid on the street, and he's a total degenerate. So you've got that, but when they find out their son, in this case, they're all boys, their son is dead and went through this kind of degradation and torture before he died, that's got to take a toll. Let's talk a little bit about the toll that takes on those relatives.
Well, in a situation where you're talking about a religious family, you'll find one of two things. You'll find some of them, depending on how deep seated their religion is, they will literally basically backslide. They'll turn. They'll just how could God allow something like this, and they'll just flat out go the opposite direction. And then others, they will grind in deeper. They'll bury in deeper and try to find faith in God, and try to use their faith as something to help heal them. And so you find two different alternatives here. Everyone struggles with it, but then you find two drastic differences in usually the way a religious family responds to this. And what people don't understand is there are families out there that will flat out disown, you know, don't ever hear from them again, never nothing. But most of the time, those disownerships actually are verbal because, look, we can't agree with your lifestyle. You can't bring drugs in this house no more. You can't do these things in our house anymore. And so it's not that they want to disown their child. It's a matter of, for safety reasons or for trying to push them into getting help, they will do these things or say these things. And so you've got more than one type of family here. You've got some who flat out say, I don't want nothing to do with you. But for the most part, you still have people that care. They just don't know how to help. And so these people end up on the streets. They haven't seen them in months or years. They don't know where they are. And then they get this devastating news, and this is, you know, there's so much back and forth in the mind there. Well, could I have done more? Should I have let them stay here even though they were doing these things? Should I, and so they've got to deal with this for the rest of their life. And I find that's the reason why a lot of people who have a religious background, they really bury in deeper into their religion, just because they've got to find faith outside of themselves. They don't have it in themselves. So they have to look to something higher than them to find the strength to go through. But most people have somebody that would like to see them again. It's not a complete, we it's not a complete disownership as in we never want to see you again. Most of the time it's if they got themselves cleaned up, they would love to have them back. So there's that perception that, oh, they're street people, no one cares. Sometimes that's the case, but a lot of times there's somebody in another state that would absolutely give their eye teeth to have them home and cleaned up. And so it really, it's devastating in so many different ways. And then of course you always think, well, maybe they died quickly, and in this case we flat out know they did not. And so the only hope you can give yourself is maybe they were drugged up enough they didn't feel as much. Because there's really no way to really compute that. In a mind that's not sick and twisted, there's no way to really understand that. And we shouldn't. If you can understand it, we're going to put you in some place. We're going to find an institution for you really quickly.
You're in trouble. You're in trouble yourself.
We're going to call some people.
Well, it does take a toll, whether they just stuff it down or they act out or whatever, but it does take a toll, because these kids, they were little boys once. They were these wonderful, lovely, fun little boys at some point in their life. There's no doubt everybody was at some point in their life. Everybody I ever knew, anyhow. So it's I don't know.
Yeah. So yeah, there was an innocence there. Yeah. And I think that's what we mourn. We mourn the loss of innocence,
And you mentioned that rationalization, and I've heard, and I've even said about older relatives, well, they didn't suffer. We like to tell ourselves that whoever it was that we cared about didn't suffer, but these pictures, and they know by now that they did suffer. But every relative knows that they did suffer. So that would have been an extra cruel blow for the relatives of these kids.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And then, knowing that you weren't there, to be able to help them in their final moments, and I mean, in a way, when someone commits murder, and this is what people don't realize, you are killing more than just that human being. You are destroying everyone that's connected to them. You are taking all the hopes, the dreams, the future that all of these people had. And that's the reason why murder is so devastating. It doesn't just take one, it affects a community, it affects a whole group of people. And so from then on, you're never the same. Even if you weren't the victim yourself,
Yeah.
it destroys you. It destroys a piece of you. And you know, one murder hits a whole lot of people. It's not just one.
Yeah, that's for sure. So let's listen to Troy tell a little bit about making the identification and that process and as they got ready to put the case together. So now detectives are piecing together these files. They start matching what was known as the torture log, and those notations were gruesome. And as Synova said before, those pictures, there were ways that Bob Berdella could go back in and relive this and get reinvigorated, if you will, by his crimes, and because he didn't have that stimulation, every day, especially after the kid died. Then it was a while before he got another one. And those notations, I would imagine, don't you, Sonoma, reading those torture logs and looking at the pictures at the same time was probably what he did, wouldn't you imagine?
Absolutely. That's the reason why they keep those. It goes beyond a trophy, and it's a way for them to relive. You know, and in our situation, you know, somebody that's not sick and twisted, we might take a video of a vacation, or we might take a picture of of our children when we're and a happy moment where they're laughing and happy, and then we go back. Why do we take pictures? I have a song that I wrote a long time ago. It's they're frozen memories, basically.
Mhm.
And I was going over a wedding picture that I found, and a lot of those people weren't in my life anymore. And I was thinking, why do we take these pictures? It's a frozen moment in time for us to relive. And so it's the same concept, just twisted. There he's going to relive this moment because he wants to remember this. And then, of course, we talked about some of his psychological disorders that we believe he had, that he actually had to have those things to be stimulated, and normal people wouldn't need that. And so we talk about psychological disorders. That's not an excuse by no means, but we're talking about that's the reason why he would have photos like that, and he would take so many. I mean, do you have 300 photos of 6 people?
No.
I'm like, I don't know if I have 300 photos actually printed out. I mean, most of them are digital now. But so that's the whole purpose of those. He's trying to relive those moments.
Yeah, really. So as the detectives are piecing this together, couple this torture log with these photos, they charged him with the death penalty. He had the original charge of kidnapping and sodomy. Now they amend it after they get Larry Wayne Person identified as one of the actual murder victims, and the picture of him being tortured and the torture logs. They put all that together, and they're going to charge the death penalty. Well, immediately, Berdella's public defender, a guy named Pat Berrigan, shows up at the prosecutor's office and says, "Hey, I got an offer. If you'll take the death penalty off the table, he'll give a full confession about every murder he's ever done, and he'll plead guilty to life in prison." And much to the disappointment, particularly Jerry Howe's father, Paul Howe, who was the one that came in the courtroom, tried to get in the courtroom with a gun to kill him. He was mad, boy. He was mad. Albert Reeder had to really talk him down afterward. Albert Reeder was the prosecutor, but the prosecutors agreed. Let's just put this away, and otherwise, with the death penalty, it goes on for the next 20 years.
Right.
And so Sergeant Troy Cole, and one of his detective, Al DeBuccaneer, the homicide unit, and the assistant prosecutor who was going to be the man in the courtroom, Pat Hall, and then Albert Reeder, who was the elected prosecutor, and the public defender sat down. Pat Berrigan, I think there was another one, I can't remember her name. Well, it doesn't matter. Sat down, and he did make his full confession in gruesome detail. And Troy Cole told me, he said, and he had a good memory too. Let's listen to what Troy had to say about this. So Synova, I can imagine, I know Troy, it took a toll on him. I know it did. He didn't like to admit it, but it did take a toll on him psychically, and it had to take a toll on everybody that was in that conversation. And you know, some things that you see or you hear is pretty hard to unhear and unsee. I got a couple in my life. I found drove up on a guy who was sitting on a chair in his front porch, and somebody had just shot him, and his entire lower jaw was blown off, and he's still sitting there, sitting up like he's going to stand up and greet you or something. It's the most macabre thing I ever seen. I tell you what, I just like, I was there when the Hyatt Regency fell, and they killed about 100 people got killed when these walkways fell, and I walked up, and just after it happened, and these people were in there, they were crushed, and all you could see was arms and legs waving out from underneath concrete, and people screaming and groaning and crying. And you know, we're just 2 or 3 people standing there. You don't even know what to do. I tell you, those things, you just don't ever forget them. So, I have to wonder about, how does that really affect people? I know how it affected me. Next weekend after that Hyatt Regency thing, I just went to movies one after another, just tried to get away from it, which is not really the most skillful way to deal with it. Wait, can you share something with us about that?
Well, and this is something that I got into real big with my coaching, and I have a whole book on it called Whispers of the Mind, How Thoughts Become Things. But I studied how the brain works, and you have the subconscious part of your mind is actually, you think a subconscious is just controls part of you, but 95% of your behavior, 95% of your whole world is revolved around your subconscious. And what people don't understand, only 5% of your behavior and your world is related to your conscious. So while you might be able to run from those macabre images, while you might be able to run from those raw emotions and those things that no human should have to see, they're still buried in there. And that's the reason why you see so many in law enforcement that, become alcoholics, or they have to go into therapy, or they have so much, a difficult home life, or these things, because we have a society that says we can see anything, we can experience anything, we can do anything, we're tough enough to handle it, but all of that still goes into your subconscious. And so you're going to end up, it might be 6 years later, something triggers something, and then it's going to come boiling back because it's still there. And until you can work through that, I went through a thing with a victim's family members group, and I said, it's deep in your attic of your subconscious. I consider that your mind attic, like Sherlock Holmes. Deep in that subconscious is this rusty old trunk that every time you get emotionally involved in that trauma, it nails it down to the floor a little harder. And you think about it, you don't want to open that trunk, but you need it out of there. And the only way you can get it out of there is to open it and deal with it and sit with it. And when you're a law enforcement officer, and what's in that trunk is dismembered bodies, you see children that have been slaughtered, you see horrific things, the worst part of mankind you have to deal with. Your trauma trunk is overloaded, and so people, we don't understand that. And then we've got this this toxic masculinity type thing. I take it a different way. We don't allow men to deal with these things. They got to be tough, you got to be strong, you got to be tough, keep it out of your face, go. In reality, if you've seen something like that, you flat out need somebody to talk to. And yet in our society, we're not allowing that because that's not a tough guy. And I think that's where we need to work on those things, because our law enforcement have to see things that no human should have to see, and they have to do it over and over and over again, and then they get up and they get back in the game again. And so I think we need to offer more support to our officers who have had to go through something like this, because your friend that you mentioned said, Troy, you may think he's got all this under control. 20 years from now, something might spark that again, and all of a sudden all that trauma in that rusty old truck's going to just come right back out. And that's where we need to understand that all of these things are going to affect you. It doesn't matter how big and bad of a man you are. it's going to affect you. And I really wish our tax dollars went to offer more support for our law enforcement, because they have to see way too much, and they have to see it firsthand. They're not like me writing about it, researching it on the computer, seeing photos. They're seeing it firsthand, and so when it comes to that kind of thing, I really have a heart to help victims' family members, and I really have a heart to help those that have had to see too much trauma. And I would gladly give my tax dollars to help with something like that, because they're never going to get over it on their own. Like you said, you was binge watching movies. That's just putting happy things in there and burying that trunk a little bit farther, So, but
Yeah.
anyways, I could go off on a tangent on that, and that's not what this is about.
Yeah. Thanks. Yeah, I understand. It's well. So let's talk a little bit about, could there be other victims out there? He agreed to give this full and open confession about everything, and I'm going to play you a little bit from what Troy's take on this. That he thinks he probably did describe every killing that he ever did, and Troy will say that it was like he was getting off on just describing those killings. Do you think there's any more out there? I kind of doubt if there is, but and they didn't
I think he
find
would have bragged
anything.
about it. I think
exactly,
with his psychology, he would have bragged about it.
Yeah. Yeah, he would. I agree. He would have bragged about it. So let's listen to Troy a little bit about what he learned in the middle of that, or during that take that I can't even think of the right word, during that interview with Bob the Butcher Berdella. So we're winding down at the end of the investigation. He's copped a plea. He'll go on and die of a heart attack a few years later in the penitentiary. But as if they didn't have enough to do, Geraldo Rivera showed up to do a show and bring stir the pot a lot, and get a lot more calls of people calling in, because people want to see a conspiracy. And the investigators weren't seeing it. It was a one-man show as far as they could tell, but they were wanting to see a conspiracy. They were wanting to see this was part of some satanic ritual that Bob Berdella belonged to a witch's coven, or he was some kind of a warlock or a witch himself, because he had all these weird things that he was into anyhow. Weird robes.
He was Catholic. He was raised Catholic. And that's one thing that the conspiracy theorists always love to twist the Catholicism in it.
Really interesting.
Yeah, it's one of the biggest conspiracies. Anything to do with if you happen to be Catholic, your sixth cousin is Catholic, they're going to write a conspiracy about you.
I didn't really realize that.
It is. It's really big.
and this was during a time when we had what we'll affectionately call, some people may not like this, they'd take a offense, or at least an opposite view of this, the satanic panic. And it was going around the country, and there were some people that were wrongfully convicted of child abuse out in California, and it was all part of this satanic panic, and there were policemen that were involved. I had one working for me. There was one in Kansas City, Kansas, and they were into this satanic panic. They were running around looking for witches' covens and trying to find people that were abusing kids, and nobody ever came up with any solid evidence. I had to tell that detective that worked for me, I said, Lenny, I said, there's people that abuse children. There's people that abuse children that maybe know each other, but I don't think that there's like these big groups that are witches and they believe in Satan, and they have these meetings and stuff, and then abuse children like you're alleging and like you're searching for there. But I could tell I didn't convince her.
Very far.
I did not convince her. And then Troy Cole, the sergeant, had to fend off all kinds of questions and weird telephone tips from people trying to connect this to different Satanist groups, and so in the end they never found any connection at all. And he did expend some detectives' time going down this path, just because you cannot leave anything out there, because it'll come back and bite you every time.
Right. Well, if you want to talk about that, I've studied theology and conspiracies probably twice as much as I have true crime and psychology. So, if you want to talk about satanic panic, we could probably make a whole video on that. But if you want to get to the basic roots of good and evil, if somebody does an evil act, that evil act could be classed as satanic. If you want to get if you want to go far reaching, anytime you do something evil against another human being, it could be classed as satanic.
Yeah.
It could be classed as evil, it could be classed as bad, but when you are talking about evil as in satanic panic, this was all a bunch of conspiracy theories where people were just now maybe realizing that there's people that don't believe the same way they did, and in this lack of knowledge and understanding of other religious cultures and other things, they started labeling everything drastic and going on conspiracy theories. But when it comes to Berdella, he didn't have pentagrams all over his house. He wasn't a part of some secret society. He wasn't even part of the Catholic Church. He was raised Catholic. He abandoned all of that. So you can't really link him to any group of satanic anything. You can't link him to nothing. There isn't. He was a loner to the point where he wouldn't be considered a part of any group. And so he didn't go every Tuesday night, to some ritual in the Grove, because he wouldn't fit in with the Tuesday night crew, and so he doesn't fit that whole stereotype. Besides the fact there was no pentagrams, there was no, he didn't mix the blood of the humans with goats. He didn't have goats' heads buried with the humans' heads. All these things that you see in these so-called cult rituals, there was none of that. He didn't have that written in his notebook. Okay, I slaughtered a goat and then I slaughtered this kid and then I go back and you know what I mean? He didn't have that. This is a whole different animal. And I think, kind of goes back to our concept of how using the media is a double-edged sword. Rivera was gonna come in and get those ratings, and he did. He got them. Did he stir the pot? Absolutely. Did he bring in any viable leads? Probably not. If you go back and study everything, every lead that came in because of that satanic panic, I guarantee you not one of them actually led to anything substantial.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, I agree. It did stir the pot, and it did muddy the waters for a while. But I noticed it drifted off pretty quick too, and over the next few years, that whole satanic panic thing kind of drifted off. It seems like we're getting a little taste of it again here in the last few years, but not to the extent that we had it back then. It was
it was a witch
really
hunt,
really
is what that was.
It was really widespread witch hunt back then, and like I said, there were. Well, we were kind of forced, the police department. I made that one detective my satanic detective, if we got any tips on that, it was her job to go out and run down the leads. I probably wasn't the one I should have had do it, but because she ran down leads and then some, but she was interested in it. So we had a guy that she worked with at a joining department, and he was Mr. Satanic investigator in the whole Midwest, and he made a whole career out of that by the end. So
well, I guess he must have found something eventually. well, and I'm not saying that there isn't cults out there, and I'm writing a book right now on a cult that stretches from Missouri to California, and but the whole rituals, ritualistic and black magic and all that kind of stuff, it just kind of went out of control there for a while. People were seeing it everywhere.
Yeah, it did. Well, and one other thing about, I guess, from reading from what Troy said, I found interesting. Give me your take on this. Was when he is asking Berdella about, he kind of was gleeful almost in describing what he did, and when he talked about doing different things, then Troy would ask him, well, why did you do that? Well, I don't know. I just wanted to, I was just cataloging the reactions to the different drugs that I would give him. I wanted to write it down. And it was almost like he was a doctor doing an experiment on this kid, like little kids playing doctor with an animal or something. I don't know, but trying to see what kind of reactions he got. But I agree with you. I think it was just for him to go back and reread and to feel the dominance over another human being. I don't
Right.
I don't know.
I think in all reality, he didn't see them as human beings. He didn't
Yeah.
see them as equals. He saw them as test subjects. And he wanted to do something to get a reaction, and then he'd do something else and get another reaction. And then he wrote those things down like he was experimenting on these test subjects. Like somebody might experiment on a lab rat. That's the way he was treating these human beings. And so he may have not understood his own psychology, and understood why he was doing things. This is just what he was doing now. And then it led to the next thing and led to the next thing. If this worked one time, is it going to work again? And then if that didn't work, okay, let's increase the dose. So it just stepped from one thing to the next. He probably didn't take time to sit and think, why am I doing this? It was just his own morbid psychology leading him on through this path.
All right. Well, I think we have done Bob Berdella now, Synova.
I think
Don't
we
you?
have.
We
I think
have.
we have talked about him as much as we can.
Really.